Sean Doherty wrote a cool piece on Surfer Magazine a couple weeks ago about the death of pro surfing in 2020. Did you read Sean's piece on
He
that?
and I talked about it, but it was before it was released, so I did not read it.
Well, a couple things stood out. One of them was sort of a historical note that I wasn't quite sure about. And at the beginning of the piece, Sean writes, and I quote, "Ian Cairns knows pro surfing well. He invented it. In 1976, Cairns, along with Peter Townend, devised a rating system and crowned a world champion at the end of the year, which just happened to be Townend. And Cairns was in second place. So I've always thought, was of the inkling that Fred Hemmings is the one that created pro surfing. And I DM'd Ian this morning to find out, because I mean, have you ever heard that Ian Cairns invented pro surfing in 1976?
Not pro surfing, but the world tour, the pro circuit.
Did he invent pro surfing?
Not pro
that's
surfing.
What this says.
Right.
That's what Sean wrote.
Not professional surfing. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but do you agree that the distinction would be that he created the world tour?
I'm sure that he had a big part in it. I'm not trying to doubt what Ian did. I just found it interesting that there was no mention whatsoever.
Right, of Fred Hemmings.
This to me seems counter to like the millions of things I read about pro surfing when you watch Busting Down the Door, or you watch any of this, or you read about it like on maybe Matt's Encyclopedia of Surfing or whatever. I've never heard that Ian Cairns invented pro surfing. Like, to me, that sentence is like, whoa, that's what kind of, I wanted to get your opinion on that.
My opinion is, let me ask you, if you replaced pro surfing with Ian Cairns was one of the inventors of the world tour, would that ring true to you?
Yeah, I'm sure that he was. I'm sure that he had a vision for it, alongside all of those guys. And maybe I'm
that narrative, I feel like, doesn't go against Busting Down the Door specifically. You mentioned that. Like, I feel like that was the narrative of Busting Down the Door, or part of it. It's part of the storyline anyways, was that Cairns and those couple of people involved created the concept for the world tour and like the rating system and the stops and all that sort of stuff, which isn't the genesis of professional surfing, as you pointed out. But I think that the world tour might have been the distinction that Sean was trying to make.
Maybe. They devised a rating system and they crowned a world champion, is what it said.
Tell me more than...
He devised the rating system.
Explain more, especially for listeners, about what would Fred Hemmings' role be in inventing pro surfing?
Well, again, I don't want to misstep here because I'm not like a history expert, but my general gut feeling on it, like what I've been told or what my brain tells me about this, is that, Fred had the big events in Hawaii, like the Smirnoff and probably whatever. I don't even know the other, who else sponsored these things. There was probably the Duke, the Smirnoff, and maybe the Pipe Masters, right? And so you had these three events, and everybody went to Hawaii to compete in them. And then, of course, there was the Bells event, and there was probably an event in Sydney, or the 2SM, which is a radio station in Sydney, the Coca-Cola Surf About. So you had these different, and the Gunston 500 in South Africa. So you had these world events, and somebody wanted to tie them all together. And I'm sure that Ian had a part in that. I'm sure I'm sure a lot of the young pro surfers that wanted to compete on this tour were raising their hand and going, hey, why don't we do this? And I don't know who congealed the whole thing. Was it Fred that got on the phone and made the calls to the sponsors? And again, I don't know the ins and outs of it. I just thought it was interesting that Sean wrote, Ian Cairns invented pro surfing. Like, that's a pretty heady statement without giving some, credence or giving some credit, I guess I should say, to Fred Hemmings.
Yeah. It makes sense that, Hawaii being the Mecca, that it would be Australians that ended up connecting all the dots, because they had so many events going on in the country for decades, like local events that everybody would go from, travel from one place to another just to compete in those events because they were few and far between. And then knowing that Hawaii is Mecca and there's these other events happening in Hawaii, it's just logical that the people over here would be like, we need to then connect all of the dots. Hawaii wouldn't be the logical one to look at Australia and be like, hey, we're going to come play in your pond. You got to come play in ours, essentially. So,
yeah, I agree. And the sporting culture of Australia, it makes sense too, that they're like, hey man, like let's do this thing that, and I know Rabbit often talks about the professional tennis tour as like sort of a model that they looked at and went, look, these athletes travel around the world playing tennis and make money. Let's kind of, cookie cutter this idea.
What was the rest of Doherty's conceit with the article?
Oh, well, that's funny. So here, let me read it to you because it's pretty fascinating real quick. This is sort of like a bit of a summary, if you will.
Yeah, please.
The WSL's canceled 2020 season has at least seen the WSL focus on core businesses and breathe some fresh life into the tour for 2021. Starting in Hawaii and finishing at a mystery location with a final day showdown looks sound and a good idea. The home run with G-Land, Jeffreys Bay, then Chopu channels the dream tour heyday. But whether any of this gets off the ground is yet to be seen. The women's 2021 season is due to start in a couple of weeks and looks shaky. Beyond that, good luck. There are viral spot fires and raging infernos still burning. This thing isn't done by a long way, and there's what comes after that, we don't know. The realities here are epidemiological and economic, but there's an underlying social shift, David, that might have the final say. If consecutive pro tour seasons don't run, if 2020 and 2021 are scuppered, the bigger threat is a fatal disconnect with the surfing core. What if you and I, David, surfers, after 2 years without the tour, just didn't care anymore? What if it was suddenly 1970 again? The seeds of social upheaval are sown. People are in the streets already, and there are tough years ahead of us. Pro surfing has been an indulgence in a time of plenty. Where does it stand in an uncertain world? Surfing during the time of Corona has been changing in ways we don't fully appreciate even now. As Ian Cairns put it, whatever the world was in January, it isn't anymore. End of Sean Doherty's piece. It's a great piece. It's on Surfer Magazine, which still lives, by the way.
The website? So you mean surfermagazine.com?
Yes.
Or is it surfermag.com, I think?
I think it's surfer.com, actually.
Oh, is it? I bet they own all of those, actually. I always feel a need to point out when people talk about professional surfing, quote, it isn't just contest surfing. Like, there's plenty of professional surfers making a living who'd never surf a contest. Like there's this whole industry, and the narrow focus of writing an article saying like the death of professional surfing or whatever, and then strictly talking about contest surfing. There needs to be a distinction made, but let's go ahead and talk about contest surfing. He alluded to something that I hadn't even thought about, or I think was like welling up in my mind, but I hadn't put into words, is that all of the gluttony that we lived with pre-COVID feels distasteful post-COVID. Like the amount of money that we would spend dining out, let's say, or just like thinking that whatever your income is will be an endless stream forever. And let's even say an upward trajectory for a certain period of time. So I'm just going to keep spending like it's always coming. And we've all kind of learned that that isn't the case, even for the most secure. And we need to tighten our belts. And so that translates, I think, to this world tour. We harp on the idea that the world tour was bloated. Too many surfers, whatever. This solidifies that point. We simply cannot afford to send. We already know, you and I already know, we didn't need to send the judges around the world. The judges could do their job remotely in Santa Monica, and they would probably actually do it better because they weren't subject to the influence of the crowds on the beach cheering, right? So the WSL is going to, I think, figure out all of the bloat that you and I have talked about for years. And if they were to send all of the teams of people around the world to 11 stops next year with 32 or 34 surfers on the men's side, 17 on the women's side, and all of their crew, all of the hotel rooms, like that feels gross at this point. It feels too excessive. You know, like you don't need Felipe Toledo flying his entire family around the world with him to every stop and picking up the dinner tab at every like all of that just feels absurd. And by the way, it feels dangerous. You're now creating liabilities for all of these people and everybody at the hotel and all the staff and all of that. It's wrong at this point. So there's no version that looks anywhere, none of the new version looks anywhere near to what the old version does for optics alone, you know?